I'm Orkhan Amashov. You're watching Caucasus Now. After 3 years of formal peace treaty negotiations and decades of conflict, acrimony, strife, and a competition between mutually exclusive worldviews, Azerbaijan and Armenia have finally concluded the negotiations on the draft text of a peace agreement. What does this attainment signify? And in the midst of audacious hopes, reserved optimism, and some traditional misgivings, what is there next for these two nations and the wider region? Let's try to understand.
Azerbaijani and Armenian officials have confirmed that both sides have agreed on the full text of a peace agreement to end nearly 4 decades of conflict. At first glance, it may seem that we stand on the brink of history. After decades of strife and 3 years of peace negotiations, initiated in March 2022, Azerbaijan and Armenia have moved beyond rhetoric to action, finalizing a draft treaty that could reshape the South Caucasus. In many ways, this moment is indeed historic, as the agreement is intended not just as a truce, but as a strategic accord to close the chapter on one of the world's longest-running conflicts. However, the complexity of the situation should not be underestimated. Although the full text of the Azerbaijan-Armenia agreement is complete, its actual signing and ratification will depend on Armenia removing what is known as a constitutionally embedded territorial claim against Azerbaijan's Karabakh region by means of referendum and the dissolution of former OSCE Minsk Group by means of Baku and Yerevan, jointly applying to the OSCE. One of the two previously unresolved articles of the peace treaty relates to the non-deployment of third-party forces along the interstate border. The recent extension of the EU civilian mission's mandate on the Armenian side of the border until February 2027 complicates the timeline, raising the question of whether the deal should be signed before or after the mission's conclusion. Supporters of the peace agreement would see it as a test of political will, strategic foresight, and the ability to turn historical animosity into a shared future. Meanwhile, those familiar with the intricacies of Azerbaijani-Armenian relations are likely to welcome the finalization of the treaty's text, but caution that its success depends on meeting the remaining conditions. As Azerbaijan and Armenia move closer to signing this landmark treaty, the region stands at a crossroads. One thing is clear: these developments will not only shape the futures of both nations, but also redefine the South Caucasus. Change is on the horizon, and its first contours are already becoming visible.
Well, to discuss this crucial development, I'm very much delighted to welcome Dr. Asbet Kochukyan, Professor of Political Science, International Relations and Diplomacy, joining from Yerevan, Armenia. Dr. George Michelishvili, Associate Professor at the European University, joining from Tbilisi, Georgia. And Mohammad Mohammadov, Research Fellow at Topchubashov Center, joining from Baku, Azerbaijan. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Orkhan, for having us.
Asbet, my first question is going to be addressed to you. Although practically everybody in Azerbaijan and Armenia, preponderant majority of analysts in this country and in Armenia, knew only too well that there were only 2 unresolved provisions concerning non-deployment of third forces and also mutual withdrawal of international legal cases. Still, when Azerbaijani Foreign Minister Ceyhun Bayramov, on the sidelines of the Baku Global Forum, announced that the draft text had been done and dusted, had been finalized, it came like a bolt out of the blue. If I may resort to language employed by our common friend and acquaintance, Onyx James Morrison Krikorian, what is your evaluation of the degree of the attainment?
Thank you for the question, Orkhan. There are a couple of things and a couple of caveats that we need to keep in mind here. Your introduction was succinct and to the point, and holistic as well. But when we talk about analyzing events and things, sometimes it's more important to know or to understand what is not being said. How is it being said and not being said, and sometimes more important than what is being said. I think, first of all, the announcement from my reading happening right at the beginning of the Baku Global Forum might have been a sort of a brownie point for Azerbaijan to show that it has actually attained a lot of progress when it comes to diplomacy. Usually in cases like these, you end up having the two sides having a joint declaration. It seemed that the Armenian side just, was trying to catch up. Immediately afterward, they said, yes, we agreed, and so on. So that's one of the things, the optics of the issue. That's one. The second thing is that you use the audacious hope. I think that is a very good sort of approach. While a lot of details are not clear, a lot of information is not clear as to what is going to happen and what are the details. There are a lot of room. There's a lot of room for a dissection and analysis. So from this perspective, it's fascinating to see the global reaction, right? Everyone ran into congratulating both Armenia and Azerbaijan that everything is great, starting from Georgia all the way to Mexico, foreign ministries. It seems that the international community has the thirst for at least some kind of a good news of ending one conflict. Although I wouldn't hold my breath yet. There are a lot of issues here, the preconditions, the elements of that, and more often than not, just the fact that you do not have confidence among them. The fact that it was not a joint statement, I think that is a key, at least in my view, that is a key read. That's a key sort of tell about the overall situation. So, and last week when we were talking about the issue of peace in the region and the impact of Ukraine-Russia sort of peace agreement, I think in a way it sort of like goes into that there is some kind of an urgency, at least on the Azerbaijani side, to announce this. Or it could be a diplomatic ploy in terms of showing that, as I said, there's a global forum. We are, Azerbaijan would say, we did this, we have the thing, now the burden of proof is on Armenia, which we'll talk about a bit later, I think, without going into much details.
Well, thank you, Asper. Very interesting views. Mohammed, although I described this news as a bolt out of the blue, in reference to what Onik Grigorian wrote very recently, still, amongst Azerbaijani analysts that I have had a chance to speak to, it sort of did not produce, in a positive sense, a blimey crikey effect. Why do you think? And why do you think that this news came out as a unilateral statement instead of coming out as a joint statement, as was the case back in December 2023?
I do believe that the answer lies in the opening speech of the Global Baku Forum, where President Aliyev openly said that there is almost zero trust between Armenia and Azerbaijan right now. It's we should look at the situation in a more comprehensive way. Yeah? On the one hand, it's significant that it was done in a bilateral way. Yeah, we have come a long way in that regard, that the process started with the active participation and involvement of third actors, mediators, the United States, the EU, and Russia, and then it came all the way down to bilateral negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So the first success was in border delimitation agreement, about 12 kilometers of the bilateral borders, and now we have this draft peace treaty. So in that regard, this is a significant achievement. But on the other hand, we have to accept that it's still a complicated process, and there is a huge mistrust. Like a zero trust between the parties. So in that regard, I think I think in the long term, that's the main bottleneck the two sides will have to deal with to overcome the let's say, open the way for more significant results in that regard.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, the lack of mutual trust is one of those things which needs to be addressed, of course. But after all, what has been attained, the fact that Azerbaijan and Armenia managed to finalize a reasonably comprehensive, not so comprehensive, but reasonably comprehensive document containing 17 provisions, is an achievement, of course, on its own. Georgia, naturally, has welcomed the conclusion of this peace treaty negotiations between Baku and Yerevan, describing it as a historic step towards lasting peace and stability in the region. How important is it for Georgia that Baku and Yerevan conclude a peace agreement and take necessary steps towards full normalization. How important is it from the perspective of Georgia's national interests?
Well, of course, the importance for Georgia cannot be overestimated. So Georgia, well, and I mean the entirety of society, waited with impatience until the relations between our close neighbors, our friendly countries, will normalize. Obviously, so we cannot be overly optimistic. Obviously, a lot of steps must be done. So the previous speakers and you in the introductory remarks mentioned the preconditions. Of course, there are several hurdles, and but I try to find some positive spins from this situation. Yes, the statement was made unilaterally, but probably implicitly Armenia agrees with it. Otherwise, with zero trust, it would be impossible. I believe that years of negotiations, years of meetings, attempts to iron out the text created the nascent trust between the parties, which is super important in diplomacy. Yes, obviously the personal relations and personal sometimes attitude and rapport, of course, do not translate into the putting the interest of their own country in the back burner. Obviously, first of all, diplomacy is the implementation. This is the executive branch. But on the other hand, it is so I believe that there is this ice is thawing. And therefore, the things are rolling. And obviously, so Georgia has been waiting for it for a long time. About a week ago, it was mentioned that we shouldn't be striving from any 3+3 format. We need to be 3 countries. Yep. And obviously, if our region starts to resemble as bona fide, normal, full-fledged, genuine region, it has tremendous strategic outcomes. It has tremendous strategic advantages. Well, we should also understand that, it seems that the new U.S. administration finally this interest trickled down to South Caucasus. Well, maybe trickled out is not the right term, but it's now ready to turn for these smaller countries and the regions. I believe that, for instance, the meeting of the U.S. ambassador with the Georgian foreign minister is something that would be unimaginable about a month ago, which the U.S. clearly stated that this government and the representatives are illegitimate, but now there is a meeting. Also, Jerusalem Post at least reported that Witkoff was in Baku for about 8 hours. So it seems that the region comes to the fore. It seems that in the coming weeks will witness some important steps where South Caucasus will play the role. It coincides with the renewed vigor of the European negotiations, of the European activity in terms of its security and so becoming a genuine geopolitical actor. Turkey is actively involved in this negotiation in creating this new security order. So therefore, South Caucasus is a neighboring country. South Caucasus is the region which is next to Europe. And I think in this new architecture, this is definitely a good news. Obviously, so I believe that the coming weeks will witness the further steps. Doing away with the Minsk group, which is de facto dead for a few years. Setting the dates for the referendum and some other steps. Well, obviously, then another meeting between the minister or some other representatives will be a very positive sign. And I am a little bit more than cautiously optimistic. I would say moderately optimistic in this regard.
Thank you, George. Asbed, the fact that these negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia have been bilateral since late 2023, I suppose testifies to their embryonic form of mutual trust emerging in the context of Azerbaijan and Armenia. Very recently, Taron Chakoyan, I think he's a deputy chief of the staff of the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, said that the alternative to a peace agreement is war. If there is no peace, there will be war. And if the opposition is against a peace agreement, then it is forced to admit that it is in favor of war. What is the feeling inside Armenia about the inevitability of peace deal? And to what extent this feeling is also informed by what's happening outside this region. I mean by outside the region, I mean the international landscape.
It's interesting that as you were talking about the alternative for peace is war, it just a memory flashed to my mind is that the same discussion and the same phenomenon happened in mid 1990s, right? At the time, it was also bilateral agreements or bilateral negotiations going on between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and at the same time, by 1997, the Armenian administration at the time also basically put the choice between peace and war. Like, we have to sign an agreement and sign and finish this, otherwise it's going to be war. So it's sort of history repeating itself. To paraphrase JFK, who himself paraphrased Tacitus, the Roman historian Tacitus, victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat is an orphan. Peace agreement has 1,000 sort of supporters, and the implementation of it is where the problem will come in. I think this is one of the key elements. A lot of countries want to be irrelevant without being useful. That is something very important to keep in mind. And in terms of the domestic impact of this, or what would it mean? See, I think there are a lot of misconceptions, both among policymakers, but also among the population in almost all countries. Policymakers would think that, okay, peace agreement like that, tomorrow everything will be great, the economy will take off and so on. But, it takes a while until things, even if I would not share the over-enthusiasm, as I would put it, George's over-enthusiasm about the possibility. But even if there were to be a peace, I don't think the fruits will be ripped anytime soon. So that's one thing. In terms of the public, it's also policymakers. They have to also realize that the issue of the preconditions, and I think this is an understanding of the internal dynamics, internal mechanics of each country. Without going into a lot of detail, the Armenian political process is a multi-nuanced one, and it cannot be unilaterally sort of decided by anyone. There are too many forces, too many negotiations, and too many compromises need to be done, and the due process. So that actually is something that I hope the Azerbaijani side will understand, and understand that such a precondition is not going to happen anytime soon. Even if it's a precondition is removing or altering the constitution, that at least will require 6 to 8 months to put in place a referendum and so on and so forth. So if we were to look at it from that perspective, no peace is going to be signed for another 8 months at least. Now that is one in terms of the domestic, and I think the opposition in Armenia has to really get analyzed, or has to have an opportunity to analyze the content of the agreement. As of now, we're talking about a concept. We're not talking about the details. We're talking about a concept of peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I mean, the last 2 points that were a hurdle, the constitutional change and the third party forces present on the border. I think these are just minor cosmetic, in my opinion, they're cosmetic. However, one thing that I have to say is that the problem is, I haven't seen this among any analysts as of now, looking at it. The third-party forces, everyone assumes it's the EU monitoring force, which can be altered. I don't think that's a major issue. It's at the end of the day, it's a civilian monitoring force, and it can be altered as it is. But I think. And I'm wondering, rather than thinking, I'm wondering, maybe third-party forces is also a way to block Russia, for instance, or Turkey coming in. It's quite interesting that Russia was one of the first to say that we're ready to support and so on. I'm not sure about President Aliyev, but Prime Minister Pashinyan is going to go to Moscow for May 9th, a major shift in the last couple of a year or two in terms of boycotting a lot of meetings and so on. So there are a lot of balls up in the air trying to figure out what's going to happen when. But I think the one final point about this, in terms of the optimism, if there is going to be any optimism about getting this done, and I think that is an issue of of having not necessarily a third party monitoring, but a third party guarantor of this. In the absence of good relation, in the absence of any relations, you do need a party accepted by both sides to be able to sort of resolve issues. Just today, earlier today, there was reports of fire, shots being fired on the border. Armenia said they didn't do that. Azerbaijan said they did. So, okay, so in a situation like this, how do you resolve this? Is it he said? And easily, if my mood is bad today, I would wake up and say, yeah, well, our Azerbaijan is going to attack us. I'm going to attack it first. Or Armenia is amassing forces. So there has to be some mechanism. I think this is the key element of any diplomacy. We're not talking about friendly countries solving a border issue. We're talking about, as you talked about in the report, 4 decades of conflict, two societies that don't know anything about each other, unlike in the 1990s where there was some understanding. So these are the issues, I think, that have to be questioned by both policymakers and as well as the public. And one final point. I'm sorry, I'm abusing my time. There is one provision that about the withdrawal of cases, human rights cases from international courts. I think this could also become a problem, become a challenge, mostly because of the fact that when we look at the situation, it is possible for individual citizens, for instance, to take a case to a national or an international court against Azerbaijan. So in that case, would Baku argue that Armenia violated the precondition? So many ifs and buts, but then it's not possible to actually get the words of both countries or the leaders of both countries. There has to be some mutually agreed upon third party to help sort these out.
Indeed, Asper, there are quite a number of balls in there. And the kaleidoscope of the negotiations are still there, not so entrenched. Things may change. Certain provisions could be reflected upon again. But I think that Azerbaijani sensibility has always been centered around this process being purely bilateral, third-party involvement being excluded. But of course, Mohammed will reflect on that. Mohammed, yes, indeed, as Asper mentioned earlier, we heard the news about from the Azerbaijani Defense Ministry suggesting that Armenian armed forces fired at the Azerbaijani positions along the conditional border. What is the danger of an unexpected escalation along the border in the first place? And what do you make of some of the points made by Asped regarding third-party involvement, which fundamentally is against Azerbaijani position, but of course everything must be taken into account and reflected upon very carefully. Please, Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Well, I think this kind of small escalations along the border happened even after the EU monitoring mission was deployed along the conditional borders. So I don't think that they will lead to any significant, let's say, drawback in the latest momentum in the bilateral negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Interestingly, it always happens when there is some kind of rapprochement, fortunately, the two sides have so far overcome this, and the negotiations continued constructively in some ways. When it comes to Asped's comments, I definitely agree. But when it comes to the issue of guarantors or to the establishment of a kind of mechanism that would prevent this cross-border escalations, it's a very tricky issue because, I mean, again, I always bring it to this indivisibility of security concept mentioned in the Paris Charter in 1990. When we always discuss the Ukraine conflict now, it's always said that, okay, let's say the involvement of Western, let's say, actors in the process, both in military and political field, led to kind of miscalculations on both Ukrainian and Russian side. Again, to apply it to the Azerbaijan-Armenia case, the point is that the deployment of the EU monitoring mission and later the allocation of some financial assistance to Armenia within the EPF, European Peace Facility mechanism, it all led to understanding and perception in Azerbaijan that the Western powers, the United States and the EU, are backing Armenia. Again, whatever the strategic rationale behind it, it can be for peaceful purposes, to create some kind of environment that the two sides would be sure about the peaceful conditions along the border and independently focus on peace negotiations. But it didn't happen that way. I think Azerbaijani side perceived it in a different way. I think from security point of view that it led to divisions from again, in security terms in the region, that Armenia is being backed by, let's say, the EU and the United States, and Azerbaijan should have to form its own balancing measures against that. So the question is, we can discuss what kind of guarantees or, again, external involvement that we can attract to the process, that it does not lead to zero-sum calculations, and it does not lead to securitization, further securitization of the issue from the either side. So in that regard, so far, we haven't, I don't see any formula. Again, it mostly emanates from the increasing tensions between Russia, the main interlocutors, external, Turkey, and then the Western countries. So I think many will depend on the, let's say, so-called new reset between the United States and Russia, how it will evolve. So far, it's quite uncertain. Today, Trump says one thing, and tomorrow he takes very different action. Now he's pressuring Russia. And so it's very, very uncertain situation that affects the calculations of both Armenia and Azerbaijan. But if we see some sort of normalization between the United States, the EU, and Russia, maybe in that regard, this issue can come back to the agenda. But I don't think that under current circumstances, I mean, its possibility is quite low.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Mohammed, for your...
Orkhan, may I interject here?
By all means, Asbed.
Mohammed said. The thing is that it's one thing to incentivize, it's another thing to keep you committed. Right? It's like you can bring the horse to the river, but you cannot force it to drink. So that's, I think, is something to think about. The other thing is that I mean, one of the conditions also was the OSCE Minsk group needs to be dissolved, which has been completely sort of inoperative for the last at least 7-8 years, and Azerbaijan has been the most discontent about it. But when I say about what I mean about the third party, not necessarily in terms of the third parties that on the border, but rather a third party that can become, that is accepted by both sides, but not on the ground, as someone who can actually act as an interpreter of the situation. Again, we don't know the content of the agreement, so it's always good. We cannot, I mean, going to international court, this and that, I mean, it takes a lot of time, and I think there is a sense of urgency here, and that is something that both sides have to also start thinking about in terms of maintaining that dialogue, because now that we signed a peace agreement, we don't need to talk with each other. Azerbaijan might say, well, we signed an agreement, we still don't like our Armenia, and Armenians would say the same thing. So, but there is an element of positive peace versus negative peace. Positive peace is the absence of war, granted. Negative peace, is the absence of war. Positive peace is the absence of war plus collaboration. We're still ways to go to get there. But I think that's what I meant by a third party.
Thank you, Asbed. Thank you for your interjection and clarification. George, as Asbed said earlier, and Mohammed also reflected on the self-same, peace, proper peace, is more than the absence of war, and peace is more than a piece of paper entitled as peace treaty. As an external observer, do you believe that these two countries, Azerbaijan and Armenia, are ready for peace? Fundamentally, we understand it will take a long time. We talk about the reconciliation between two populations, but fundamentally, as a first step, are they ready for peace? And how likely is it that we will see more official encounters between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Tbilisi? Because quite a number of discussions have taken place in Brussels, in Washington, before a certain stage even in Moscow, but not so much has happened in Tbilisi.
Okay, so that's a very good question. So in the first place, so Georgia is not quite external, but like it's external observer, but very deep vested interest in the peace, because it's like a regional neighbor, and these like the dividends of peace in the region are enormous, and therefore Georgia is like very much interested. Very early on, back in the late 80s, still within the Soviet Union, Georgia had the willingness actually to become a real mediator, all the more since Georgia has significant pockets of Armenian and Azerbaijani population. They constitute major ethnic minorities. And by the way, so I want to say pretty proudly as a citizen of Georgia, so very few signs of conflict between them. I have several friends, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, who are friends between themselves. So, and in the first place, they have allegiance to Georgia, since they are citizens of Georgia. So obviously, so the absence of war and absence of hostilities means that there is no wherewithal, financial or military at the moment, actually, like to conduct it. It takes significantly more. It takes political will, and it takes So the peace should, the case for peace should outweigh the cases of war. And of course, in this regard, international mediators, international friends are crucial, very unfortunately. So, well, let alone the Minsk group, many European countries, United States, well, until very recently, they made statements, they made steps which pretty much eviscerated the trust on one party or the other. Well, maybe when we go to talk to the Western actions, it's probably Azerbaijan, which is believed that it was being shortchanged until recently. When it comes to Russia, like, it was a recent change in the overall the rhetoric and the policy. It believes, well, Armenians believe that Russia is no longer a trusted partner and as a traitor. So therefore, it is a significant deficit. Well, there is a signs of normalization between Armenia and Turkey, maybe within this new European security architecture, which is being forged before our eyes. It will be possible that this Euro Plus will become a not only the mediator, but potential guarantor, because when we talk to peace, it's just the goodwill and the trust of the parties is not enough. There should be a guarantor dimension. It means that potential muscle, at least economic, and other means of influence. Well, in this regard, Georgia cannot be more than a platform, obviously, so you can be assured that throughout Georgian political spectrum and society, there is a big willingness to see our neighbors signing the genuine peace agreement and the war to be stopped. But obviously, so when, by the way, early on, I mentioned when Georgia wanted to become the potential mediator, but well, Georgia started to experience Russian perfidies in terms of supporting separatists very early on, still when the Soviet Union was formally before the disintegration of the Soviet Union. That's why, so Georgia had very early on had its own set of huge problems like economic meltdown, like separatist movement and civil wars. So only recently Georgia became a relatively functioning state, but still because of its small weight, small GDP and well other weaknesses, it cannot be more than a willing platform, willing the venue where the representatives of Armenia, Azerbaijan can meet. But obviously, I think there should be a homework at the moment for both Armenia, Azerbaijan. So apart from ironing out this the treaty and holding referendum and Minsk group, trying to find the partner, trying to find the force they both trust and who could become a guarantor. It's not an easy task, obviously, but I believe it might be doable within this new forming architecture.
Indeed. Here, when we refer to Georgia as a possible mediator, we don't talk about Georgia mediating as such, but only providing a platform for two countries, for the foreign ministers of two nations or even leaders come together instead of meeting somewhere outside the region. So it's not about that sort of mediation, but rather about merely providing platform venue. And that was indeed applicable to the Germany platform when the foreign ministers met in Berlin last year, I think in April, and then in Kazakhstan, and that's what we meant by venue. Aspet, you earlier mentioned about those international legal cases, and you said that if there's going to be an individual case, will it be against the treaty provision or not? I think what was meant there referred to state actions, not individual actions. So one of the provisions agreed, which was previously unresolved, refers to this mutual withdrawal of international legal cases. Very recently, in fact, actually on the 13th of March, UN Human Rights Council's working group on arbitrary detention published an opinion effectively rejecting the Armenian side's, official Armenian side's claims that Ruben Vardanyan was arrested for his freedom of expression and political activities. The Armenian application was based on the idea that his arrest was arbitrary. Now we're talking about building mutual trust, not interfering with each other's internal affairs, but it looks like there is still a sense amongst those in the Armenian establishment that the case related to former separatist leaders should be pursued. Do you agree with this assessment, and what does this signify? And what, in principle, I think I will put this question to Mohammed later as well, what does this trial, which is ongoing in Baku, tell us about Azerbaijan and Armenia in terms of what is to come next? Because quite a number of revelations have been made in that particular case so far.
Right. This is a major issue. I personally think that the issue of the trials in Baku, as the Armenian side would put it, short trials, and Azerbaijan saying it's within its sovereign right to do these trials, to hold these trials, and so on. I think it's a rallying point for the opposition in Armenia to use against the government, that the government is not doing anything to free these prisoners. And for also Azerbaijan, is it an opportunity to show that it has actually reestablished not only its sovereignty but also its authority and will over all of the country, including what it might see as its former citizens or its citizens. So I think this is something that can go on, and I personally do not think that this is other than this theatrics, if you want to call it, it has any other real value. If there's a decision to go ahead and have an agreement and proceed with an agreement, I think that issue will be resolved behind the scenes and in a way that can be beneficial for both sides. The other thing is that this whole dimension of positive peace, negative peace, what will come next, and so on and so forth, it really depends on the international dynamics as well. Again, how fast would the sides sign an agreement before Russia comes back to the region? To what extent Georgia might be pulled by Russia to not be part of this regional dynamic, whereas Armenia and Azerbaijan might gravitate away from Russia. I'm not saying towards where, because clearly probably neither side also knows at this point. Everything, as I said, is up in the air. And at this point, we threw around the word trust a lot, and I think this is the time which reminds me of the saying attributed to Oliver Cromwell, where it says, "Trust in God, but keep the gunpowder dry." I'm not talking about war in this context. I mean, keep the trust, trust in the agreement, but do not necessarily stop exploring opportunities to further enhance the agreement that has already been preliminarily agreed upon.
Indeed. Indeed, Azerbaijani argument is, as I understand it, is based on the idea that if Armenia does recognize Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, in fact, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan is saying that Armenia has always recognized Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, even back in 1991, although we know about those reservations to the ratification of Almaty Declaration, then why on earth the arrival of Ruben Vardanyan in Azerbaijan's sovereign Karabakh region back in late August, early September 2022 should be a matter of this application. Mohammed, do you think, Aspet has been very clear about what he thinks about this trial. Do you think the outcomes emanating from this trial of Vardanyan and other separatist leaders will eventually bring these two countries together?
Well, for now, it looks no, because at least Armenia and Azerbaijan for now thinks differently on this case. And as you know, recently, Azerbaijan officials have been very open that the comments from the Armenian side are not useful for the ongoing process inside Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan sees it as interference in its domestic affairs. So, in that regard, I think Azerbaijan's rationale is very clear. Anything that challenges or threatens its domestic sovereignty, let's say its sovereignty, will be punished severely. So that's why I think. Again, whatever the rationale behind it, Azerbaijani side wants to show that it will be very severe with those who want to challenge its territorial integrity. When it comes to Azbek's positive peace comments, I would like to engage that very interesting point that I think with Armenian, Azerbaijani, and also our Georgian friends should discuss widely. I think here Azerbaijan's point is, if I'm not mistaken, presidential advisor Mr. Hikmet Ajiyev in late 2023 said Azerbaijan's goal now is to win peace. Yeah, winning the peace is the main goal. So sometimes winning peace is more difficult than winning the wars. Yeah, in the case of wars, you mobilize your domestic resources efficiently, economy, and you have some strong allies, and you overcome your enemy. But in the case of peace, you have to show both strategic restraint, and at the same time you have to pursue your own goals. So I think in the case of Azerbaijan right now, winning the peace means making Armenia, even sometimes through pressure, because last 4 years showed that unfortunately some of the positive results came not through constructive negotiations, but sometimes through pressure, to recognize its territorial integrity, I mean, for once and for all, because not only in the words, but in the documents. So this is part of the negotiations on the constitutional amendments. So on the other hand, Azerbaijan should engage Armenia and should make sure that Armenia is part of the process, or in the case of writing the rules of the game for the newly emerging order in the South Caucasus. Okay, maybe it's imperfect analogy, but again, what happened after First World War, after the Cold War? Yeah, let's say there are two sides. One of them are excluded from the process of writing the rules of the game, so it in the end leads to the vicious circle of conflicts, and if we take into account that power is dynamic in international relations, and no one guarantees that in the near future or in the long term the balance of power will not shift in favor of Armenia. So I think the positive peace part of Azerbaijani approach could be that. Yes, all of its let's say main requirements from Armenia, which is again based on its recognition on documents, both domestic and international, to recognize Armenia, so that Armenia is entangled in a legal and institutional framework, so that in case of any change to the balance of power, no one will be able to challenge. I mean, the cost of the challenging this system, this new status quo, will be very high. And on the other hand, I think it's also in the interest of Armenia to be part of its regional connectivity frameworks, and also its borders with both Azerbaijan and Turkey is opened. And so we are talking about the middle corridor. China is interested in this corridor. The European Union is interested. And in the case of, we see Trump and Russia rapprochement, we'll see maybe some sort of much closer relation with China and the EU. So there is much bigger interest in the land route between the EU and China. So Armenia can be part of this. So the point is, both a realist argument that there's a balance of power considerations, and also a liberal argument that there is some kind of economic interdependence at the cost of challenging the newly emerged status quo, either by Armenia and Azerbaijan in the long term. So I think that could be part of this realist approach to the positive peace approach you raised before. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the positive peace, a peace based on long-term perspectives, and also what you refer to as economic interdependence, really that could potentially be proper long-term security guarantee, because Azerbaijan will not be interested in damaging Armenia's interests, and vice versa will be the case. That is what many analysts have been talking about. George, we talked about economic interdependence, of course, and you mentioned in your previous answer about Russia eventually at some point coming back to the region. How likely is that, and that Russia will come back in a way that will militate against the interests of these regional actors, and what should be done before Russia comes back? When I ask this question,
well,
of
you
course,
probably understand that asking a Georgian citizen about Russia, well, has some sensitivities naturally. Well, obviously, even if we see some positive gesture, we immediately recall the proverb, I fear the Greeks even bringing gifts. So when it comes to Russia, obviously the current lack of engagement of Russia in the region is caused by the fact that it is bogged down seriously in Ukraine. So therefore, even though generally for the sake of the global security and European security, the possible ceasefire in Ukraine is a boon and obviously a positive development, well, many Georgians fear maybe now Russia will try to recoup its, I would say, incomplete, whatever they perceive that the victory in Ukraine in the other regions. So unfortunately, Russia is capable of acting as a spoiler. It might come to the region with a renewed vigor, with its hands relatively freed in Ukraine. We will see. Again, my cautious optimism relies on United States. I believe that United States, I think I said pretty much similar thing along the same lines in previous program. United States right now is the only actor which is capable of seriously weakening Russia. It might play the hardball, a curved hardball towards Russia in terms of reducing the prices for the oil and natural gas, trying to cut off this the economic lifelines and the ways of circumventing the sanctions. So United States is capable. Maybe kind of those ideas were aired during the recent meeting of the U.S. representative in Russia. But obviously, so in this renewed architecture, so Russia will need several, I would say, kind of like preconditions in order to become a different actor. I hardly believe that the current leadership of Russia is capable and willing to be anything but the spoiler in the region, because they do have this imperial mindset. So normal cooperation, win-win, I believe is non-existent for them at the moment. Well, you can accuse me of being, as a Georgian, being partial in this regard, but it has shown that maybe it could be more, I would say, constructive in other regions, but the former Soviet Union is a backyard. Unfortunately, kind of like this mentality is dissolved. I believe that now, for many, on many counts, the very term of post-Soviet space is already a misnomer. So the countries took very different path, but for Russia, it is still there. So therefore, I do have serious apprehensions as to Russia coming like to the region as a in a renewed guise. So it's like certain imperial features, certain imperial, I would say, mindsets. They occurred very difficult in a very difficult way. I believe only significant defeat would make Russia think differently in this particular regard. But I do believe in this potentially renewed Europe, with Turkey being the significant part of the architecture. I do believe that the new U.S. administration, after so many statements, controversial statements, so maybe they were just a smoke screen and they will just like take care of the region in a more significant fashion. All the more since, well, it's Central Eurasia. It is a region which borders Middle East, borders Europe, which is by the Black Sea, which is on the route of very significant, huge transport and energy communications. So maybe the peace dividends and this positive will and the ability to project its political, economic, well, when necessary, the military capabilities on the region will win Russia off its imperial habits.
Oh. George, thank you very much indeed for your answer. Of course, there are certain limitations to the assertion that Russia is going to come back. Russia is already there, has never left properly. I mean, 2 breakaway regions of Georgia controlled by Russia-backed stateless, we know that. Of course, Armenia is still a member of the Russia-dominated organization. There's a Russian military base there. But on the good note, I mean, Azerbaijan is different in this respect because Russian troops left Karabakh, Azerbaijani territory, back in April 2024. I'm grateful to all of you for your time, and thank you very much indeed. This was Aspet Kochikyan, Professor of Political Science, International Relations and Diplomacy, joining from Yerevan, Armenia. Dr. George Micheleshvili, Associate Professor at European University, joining from Tbilisi, Georgia, and Mohammad Mohammadov, Research Fellow at Topchubashov Center, who joined from Baku, Azerbaijan. We discussed this latest development revolving around the fact that the draft text of the peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia has now been finalized, and in fact that the future looks incredibly positive, provided those other circumstances and the measures in relation to those circumstances are also taken into account and implemented in due course. This was Caucasus Now, and see you very soon indeed.